My father said he was too sick to attend my wedding. 3 days later, while I was still trying to push away the sadness of his empty seat on the most important day of my life, I saw the photo. Not in a hospital bed, not in a doctor's office, but on a tropical beach, tanned, beaming, and hand in hand with his new wife. The feeling in that moment wasn't just disappointment. It was a cold, invisible knife, twisting into the dream I had nurtured for 26 years. For me, a wedding was always synonymous with the image of my father walking me down the aisle. It wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a vivid film that had been playing in my mind since I was a little girl. I could see every detail, my dad in a sharp suit, his arms steady for me to hold, and a warm smile reserved only for me, his little girl, even as he was about to give me away to the love of my life. That dream was tied to a promise, a sacred symbol. It was my grandfather's gold-plated Tissot watch, a family heirloom my father always cherished. He once told me when I was a teenager, his voice warm and full of pride, that on the day his daughter got married, he would personally place that watch on his new son-in-law's wrist. It was how our family, he'd said, welcomed a new man into the fold. That watch wasn't just an object. It was succession, a blessing, an acceptance. It was everything I wanted from my father on my wedding day. The first hairline cracks in that perfect film began to appear after my parents divorced, and my dad remarried Laura. Our relationship didn't just become distant. It was a slow fade into irrelevance. His time, his attention, it all seemed to be siphoned away by his new family, by Laura and her daughter Carly. The calls became less frequent, the conversations shorter. But I stubbornly believed that the bond between a father and daughter was unbreakable. That when my most important moment arrived, he would set everything aside and be there. When my fiancé, Matt, and I started planning the wedding, I called him first to share the news. The silence on the other end of the line lasted longer than I expected. His reaction was a lukewarm congratulations that felt more like a placeholder than genuine happiness. I tried to stir some enthusiasm in him, telling him about the venue, the decor ideas, about how wonderful Matt was. But his responses were just hollow, distracted sounds of agreement. I told myself he was just awkward, that the years of distance had built an invisible wall. A few weeks later, I gathered all my courage to call again and ask him the most important question, if he would walk me down the aisle. Silence again. This time it was heavier. He let out a long sigh, a sound I recognized as the preface to a difficult conversation. He then brought up the past, reminding me of the severe bout of rheumatoid arthritis he'd had years ago, the one that had left him nearly bedridden. How could I forget? It was a dark time, when I was juggling school and a part-time job to take care of him. I had witnessed his suffering firsthand. He painted a picture of his current state, claiming the illness was flaring up again. He explained that his doctor had advised him to avoid travel, and most importantly, any kind of stress. He described a wedding, my wedding, as something loud and tiring that his body simply couldn't handle. Hearing him weaponize a memory of his own suffering, a time when I had cared for him so deeply, left me feeling winded. A part of me shattered, but another part felt a pang of guilt. Was I so selfish that I would ask him to risk his health for my dream? I swallowed my own pain and told him I understood, that his health was the most important thing. It felt like a lie in my own mouth. In the weeks that followed, I didn't give up. I called with solutions, offering to hire a comfortable private car, to book a hotel room right next to the venue. But every suggestion was gently pushed aside, always circling back to the same excuse: his health. The final conversation happened 2 weeks before the wedding. I was practically pleading, explaining that he didn't have to do anything but be there, that just seeing him in the front row would mean the world to me. He gave me a final, gentle apology, saying he just couldn't make it. His voice was full of rehearsed regret. But just as he was finishing, his tone suddenly became rushed. I could hear a muffled but sharp female voice in the background, unmistakably Laura's. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the cadence was impatient, demanding. It was the sound of someone being told to hurry up, that they were late for something. He quickly mumbled another apology and hung up. I stood there, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. Late? Late for what? A doctor's appointment, or something else entirely. The tiny seed of doubt I had tried so hard to bury suddenly sprouted, promising a truth far more painful than any illness. The seed of doubt planted by that overheard conversation festered during the final 2 weeks of wedding preparations. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just stressed, that my disappointment was making me paranoid. But the feeling lingered, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. Every time I tried to picture my father walking me down the aisle, the image would be corrupted by the sound of Laura's impatient voice. Then the wedding day arrived. It was a perfect June day, with sunlight like honey and a cloudless sky. Everything was as beautiful as Matt and I had dreamed. My dress felt like a cloud, the scent of fresh peonies hung in the air, and Matt, waiting for me at the altar, looked so handsome it took my breath away. Our friends and family were all there, their laughter and well wishes a warm embrace. Everything was perfect, except for the gaping, hollow space in the front row where my father was supposed to be. As my mother walked me down the aisle, her grip on my arm was a loving, supportive anchor in a sea of conflicting emotions. I was grateful for her, but it wasn't the sturdy, familiar arm I had imagined leaning on my entire life. Throughout the ceremony, I fought to stay present, to focus on our vows, on the loving look in Matt's eyes. But my own eyes kept drifting to that empty chair. It wasn't just a seat, it was a symbol, a silent testament to a broken promise. Later at the reception, we quietly skipped the father-daughter dance, and of course there was no presentation of the heirloom watch. Another promise, dissolved into thin air. A few days later, we escaped for a short mini-moon, renting a small cabin by a lake upstate. The quiet and the fresh air were a balm, and for the first time, I felt the knot in my stomach begin to loosen. We were scrolling through photos our friends had tagged us in, reliving the happy moments of our wedding day. I was starting to feel whole again, but that lingering suspicion, that unanswered question from the phone call, was still there. On a whim, driven by a gut feeling I could no longer ignore, I typed Carly's name into the search bar. Her profile was usually quiet, but a new album had been posted just 2 days before. The caption, complete with a sun and wave emoji, read, "Surprise family getaway." My heart started to hammer against my ribs. I clicked on it. The first photo loaded, and the air left my lungs. There he was, my father, Laura, and Carly, standing on a pristine white sand beach, a turquoise ocean sparkling behind them. My father, the man who was supposedly too crippled by arthritis to travel, was wearing a loud floral shirt, sunglasses, and a grin so wide it looked grotesque. He had one arm around Laura, the other raising a cocktail in a toast. They looked blissful, relaxed, healthy. My hand trembled as I swiped. There were dozens more. Photos of them on a yacht, clinking champagne glasses. Photos of them dining at a restaurant overlooking the ocean. A picture of my father and Carly posing cheesily with a starfish. Every image was a new, deliberate stab to my heart. The date stamp confirmed they were all taken and posted over my wedding weekend. Then I saw the detail that made it all click into place. Carly, who meticulously tagged every person in every photo she ever posted, hadn't tagged my father in a single one. It was a calculated omission, but she had tagged the public page of the 5-star resort they were staying at. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message, delivered with plausible deniability. She had made sure I would see it, without making it easy for the rest of the family to connect the dots. The lie was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact, displayed in high-resolution color. The only question that mattered now was, what was I going to do about it? I spent the next day in a fog of pure, white-hot rage, rehearsing the furious, scathing speech I would deliver to my father. Matt was my rock, his anger a perfect, validating mirror of my own. I was just about to dial my father's number, ready to unleash hell, when my phone rang. The caller ID read Aunt Clara. I answered, my voice tight. "Aunt Clara, you are not going to believe what he did." "Honey, I know," she said, and her voice was heavy with a sorrow that went beyond simple sympathy. "I saw the pictures. It's despicable." "Despicable doesn't even begin to cover it," I seethed. "He lied to me. He made me feel guilty for weeks, all so he could go on a damn vacation." "I know, honey, but I'm so sorry. It's even worse than you think." Her tone stopped me cold. It was the careful, hesitant voice of someone about to deliver terrible news. Worse? What could possibly be worse than this? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear her take a deep, shaky breath. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she began, "but you're not a child, and you deserve the truth. This isn't about him choosing them over you. Not really. This is about Laura, and the fact that your father is in serious trouble." An information gap opened up in my mind, a chasm of confusion. "Trouble? What are you talking about?" "Financial trouble," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "That lifestyle business she started? It's a money pit. Your father poured his entire retirement savings into it, and a few months ago, she convinced him to co-sign a massive business loan. He's on the hook for everything." I sank down onto the couch, the phone pressed hard against my ear. This was not the story I had been telling myself. "That trip wasn't a vacation, honey," Aunt Clara continued, her voice laced with bitterness. "It was a desperate last-ditch attempt to meet with a potential investor. Laura told him it was their only chance to avoid going bankrupt. She convinced him that their entire future depended on that one weekend." As I listened, the clean, sharp lines of betrayal began to blur into an ugly, complicated mess. The image of my cruel, calculating father dissolved, replaced by something far more pathetic. A weak man, a foolish man, a puppet dancing on strings I never even knew existed. He hadn't just abandoned me for a vacation. He had sold his place at my side to bail out a sinking ship. When I hung up the phone, the rage was gone. In its place was a cold, heavy certainty. My father wasn't just a liar. He was a pawn in someone else's game. And as this new, heavier truth settled in my heart, a chilling question arose, one that had no easy answer. How do you confront a man who has already surrendered his own soul? For days after my call with Aunt Clara, I lived in a strange, hollow space. The raw, blistering anger had been replaced by something colder and heavier. It was the weight of understanding. I replayed my entire life with my father in my head, but this time, I was watching it through a new lens. Every missed school event, every broken promise, every time he chose someone or something else over me, it all clicked into place. It wasn't malice, not always. It was a pattern of weakness, a lifelong habit of taking the path of least resistance. He wasn't a monster, he was just a man who had abdicated his own life, and in a way, that felt even worse. Matt was my anchor through it all. He was furious on my behalf, his anger pure and simple. "He's a coward," he'd say, his jaw tight. "He let that woman ruin him, and he let her make him hurt you." His clarity helped. While I was drowning in the murky gray areas, he saw only black and white. About a week after the wedding, my father called. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee, when his name flashed on the screen. My first instinct was to ignore it. But then, a cold resolve settled over me. I needed to hear it. I needed to hear the lies one more time, now that I knew the truth behind them. I answered. "Honey, how's the newlywed?" His voice was sickeningly cheerful, as if he were calling after a minor disagreement about the weather. It was the voice of a man desperately pretending that the world wasn't on fire around him. "I'm fine, Dad," I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. Good. So listen, I feel just awful about missing the big day. Just terrible," he continued, the rehearsed guilt dripping from every word. "I want to make it up to you and Matt. I'm putting a check in the mail for you two. A little something to help you get started." I almost laughed. A check. He was trying to put a price tag on his betrayal, and he was likely doing it with money he didn't even have. "A check?" I said, letting the silence hang in the air. "Is that what you think this is about, Dad? Money?" He stammered, caught off guard. No, of course not. It's just a gesture, a token to show you how much I care since I couldn't be there." "Right, you couldn't be there." I repeated his words back to him, my voice devoid of emotion. "Because of your health." "Exactly. It was just terrible timing with my arthritis flaring up. And then Laura, well, she had planned this little surprise getaway. I didn't want to disappoint her. It was all very last minute," he rambled, spewing the exact lies Aunt Clara had predicted. This was my moment. I decided not to accuse, but to probe. Wow, a surprise trip? I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. That must have been stressful, having to drop everything for a last-minute trip like that. Was it for business? It must have been incredibly important to take precedence over your only daughter's wedding. The silence on his end was deafening. I had just thrown a grenade into his flimsy story. Business? He finally echoed, his voice suddenly defensive. No, it wasn't business. It was a family obligation. Laura needed to relax. She's been under a lot of pressure. Pressure, I said, the word tasting like poison. I see. And her relaxation was more of an obligation than walking me down the aisle. You're twisting my words, he snapped, his cheerful facade finally cracking. You don't understand. You're right, I don't, I said, my voice turning to ice. But I'm starting to. You know what, Dad? Keep your money. It sounds like you need it a lot more than I do. Before he could respond, I hung up. I stared at my phone, my hand steady. For the first time, I felt a sliver of power. I hadn't screamed or cried. I had simply held up a mirror to his lies, and the reflection had terrified him. I left him in a silence of his own making, a silence filled with a question he couldn't possibly answer. How did she know? The ball was in his court now. I knew he would have to see me. The question was no longer if he would show up, but what pathetic version of the truth he would bring with him when he did. The real showdown came 3 days later. It was a Sunday morning. The house was quiet, filled with the smell of brewing coffee and the soft light of autumn. I was curled on the couch with a book, finally feeling a sense of fragile peace. Then, the doorbell rang. My heart lurched. I knew instinctively who it was. I opened the door, and there he stood. He looked smaller. That was the first thing I noticed. The larger-than-life father figure from my childhood was gone, replaced by a man who looked tired and diminished. His shoulders were slumped, there were dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes seemed to hang off his frame. He was the ghost of the man he used to be, haunted by his own choices. He asked if he could come in, his voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to slam the door and protect the peace I had fought so hard to find. But I also knew this was necessary. This was the final chapter. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked into the living room and perched awkwardly on the very edge of the armchair, as if he were an unwelcome stranger afraid of taking up too much space. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the little girl waiting for her father's approval. I was the gatekeeper of my own life, and he was the one asking for entry. He started with the apology I knew was coming, the one Laura had probably coached him on. He spoke of his terrible mistake, of his profound regret. The words were right, but they were hollow, devoid of any real understanding. And just as I predicted, he quickly pivoted from apology to excuse. He talked about the immense pressure he was under, how Laura's business had been so stressful, how he felt like he was being pulled in a million different directions. He painted himself as a victim, a man caught in a trap not of his own making. I let him talk, let him weave his narrative of self-pity. I listened to him describe the cage he was in, without ever admitting that he had been the one to build it. When he finally ran out of steam, he looked up at me, his eyes pleading, searching for a sign of forgiveness, of understanding. He found none. Stop, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It cut through the air like glass. Just stop talking. I know, Dad. His face went pale. No? Know what? I know everything, I said, standing up and walking to the window, turning my back to him for a moment to gather my strength. I know about Laura's business. I know about your retirement savings. I know about the loan you co-signed. I know that your beach vacation was a pathetic last-ditch effort to charm an investor because you're on the verge of losing everything. I turned back to face him. The color had drained completely from his face. He looked like a ghost. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, I had left my father utterly speechless. So don't you dare, I continued, my voice low and trembling with a tightly controlled rage. Sit there in my house and try to sell me a story about stress and obligations. This wasn't about pressure. This was about a choice. Seeing his lies and excuses were useless, his face crumpled in desperation. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. He held it out to me in his trembling hand. It was the watch. My grandfather's gold-plated Tissot, gleaming under the morning light. He offered it to me as a last, desperate plea, explaining that he knew he had messed up, but he had brought this for Matt, that it was still mine, that it still meant something. That was it. The final insult. The belief that this object, this symbol of promises he had so thoroughly broken, could somehow fix the wreckage he had made. A dam inside me broke. I let out a bitter laugh. That? You think that piece of metal can fix this? You think you can just dangle that in front of me and erase everything? I took a step towards him, my eyes burning into his. That watch was supposed to be a symbol of honor, Dad. A symbol of family, of a promise being passed down. But the man who was supposed to give it has no honor left. He flinched as if I had struck him. This was never about a choice between my wedding and your bankruptcy, I said, my voice rising with every word, fueled by years of disappointment. It was a choice between your daughter and your pride, between your responsibility as a father and your weakness as a man, and you chose weakness. You have always chosen weakness. He tried to argue, to say it wasn't fair, but I cut him off. Isn't it? I shot back. You didn't get trapped by Laura. You walked into that cage willingly because it was easier than standing up for yourself. It was easier than being a husband to Mom. It was easier than being a father to me. You let her convince you that her failing business was more important than the one single day I asked you to be there for me. You didn't just lie to me, Dad. You lied to yourself. You built a whole fantasy where you're the victim, but you're not. You're just a coward. The word hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. He stared at me, his face a mask of shock and pain. The fight had completely gone out of him. He slowly lowered the hand holding the watch. He whispered that he had done his best, the final pathetic defense of a broken man. No, I said, my voice suddenly calm, chillingly so. Your best would have been being here. Your best would have been telling the truth. This is your worst. I pointed to the door. I want you to leave, and take your symbol of broken promises with you. He didn't argue. He looked from the watch in his hand to my face, and whatever he saw there told him it was over. He stood up, his movements stiff and slow, and walked to the door without another word. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence he left behind was profound. I stood in the middle of my living room, my body trembling from the adrenaline. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt empty. And then, slowly, a new feeling began to creep in. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the feeling of being free. He was gone, and in the profound silence he left behind, I realized the truth. I had spent my whole life mourning the father I wished I had. Now, for the first time, I was free to bury the one I actually got. But I had no idea that the fallout from his pathetic little empire was only just beginning. In the days following the confrontation, a strange and profound quiet settled over my life. The storm had passed, leaving behind not wreckage, but a clean, empty space. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been my companion for years, the anxiety of waiting for his calls, of managing his moods, of anticipating the next disappointment, was simply gone. In its place was a calm resolve. I hadn't just ended a conversation. I had ended a lifelong cycle of hope and hurt. I had taken back my own peace. A few days later, the check he had promised arrived in the mail. It was tucked inside a generic Hallmark card with a picture of two cartoon bears holding hands, the printed message inside babbling about love and happiness. There was no personal note, just the check, signed with his familiar looping signature. It felt less like a gift, and more like a final pathetic attempt to erase his guilt. I didn't rip it up. I didn't burn it. I simply put it in a new envelope, along with a short typed note. My message was 5 simple clinical sentences. My presence in your life was never for sale. The pain you caused cannot be compensated. I am returning this to you. Consider this chapter closed. I wish you peace. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of administration. I was closing out a bad account. The next move came from Laura. A week after I mailed the check back, I received a long, rambling text message from her. It was a masterclass in passive aggression. She wrote about how heartbroken my father was, how my unforgiving stance was causing him immense pain and stress. She suggested that, as his daughter, I had a duty to be more understanding of the immense pressure he was under. She was trying to paint me as the villain, a cold-hearted daughter punishing her poor, struggling father. Years ago, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. But now, it was like reading a language I no longer spoke. I read it once, then a second time, a cold smile touching my lips. My thumbs moved quickly over the screen. My reply was surgical. I wrote that my relationship with my father, or lack thereof, was a private matter. However, I added, his relationship with her seemed to be a business matter in the most literal sense. I told her I found it fascinating that she was so concerned about his emotional stress, when the financial stress she had put him under was the root of this entire mess. I ended the message with a single devastating line. I'd worry less about the state of my forgiveness and more about the return on your investment. From what I hear, it's not looking good. I hit send and blocked her number. I felt nothing but a cool, clean finality. The last step was to control the narrative within the family. I knew my father, wounded and exposed, would be telling his own sob story to anyone who would listen. I decided to get ahead of it. I drafted a single, clear, and factual email to my extended family, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had all been at the wedding. I didn't fill it with rage or accusations. I simply stated the facts, that my father had claimed to be too ill to attend, but had instead gone on a vacation, that he had been dealing with significant personal and financial issues that had led to his decision, and that, for my own health and well-being, I had decided to step back from the relationship. I ended by saying that I loved them all, but that I would not be discussing the matter further. I hit send and put my phone down. I had laid all the cards on the table. I had taken away their power to gossip and speculate by giving them the unvarnished, emotionless truth. I didn't know how they would react, or what my father's next move would be. All I knew was that I had stopped being a character in his tragic story and had finally started writing my own. I braced myself for a storm of phone calls, but I never could have predicted the strange, silent way the dominoes would actually begin to fall. Months passed. The silence from my father's side of the family was absolute. Autumn turned to winter, and the holidays came and went without a single word. It was a quiet, peaceful period of my life. Matt and I settled into the easy rhythm of marriage, building our own traditions, creating a home filled with laughter and stability. The drama of the past summer began to feel like a movie I had watched, a story that had happened to someone else. I was healing. Then, one cold afternoon in late February, my phone rang with an unknown number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, a prickle of old anxiety surfacing. But I answered. The voice on the other end was frantic, choked with tears. It took me a moment to place it. It was Carly. She was rambling, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of panic. She was asking if I had heard from him, if I knew where he was. Through her sobs, the story came out, piece by devastating piece. The investor they had been courting on my wedding weekend had backed out. Apparently, the story of my father missing his own daughter's wedding for their meeting had spread through our family's network and made him seem unstable and unreliable. Without that investment, Laura's business had completely imploded. The massive loan they had co-signed was called in by the bank, and they were facing total financial ruin. And my father, the man who couldn't handle pressure, had done what he always did. He ran. About a month ago, Carly explained, he had just disappeared, packed a bag and left, leaving only a short note. He had cut off all contact, except for a few vague texts. And then, the final domino fell. That morning, Laura had been served with divorce papers. He hadn't even had the courage to tell her to her face. He just mailed them. As I listened to this catastrophic tale of collapse, a strange, involuntary sound escaped my lips. It was a short, sharp, bitter laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of a dark, cosmic irony so perfect it was almost poetic. The exact pattern of abandonment, of cowardice, of running away from problems that he had subjected me to my entire life had been repeated. But this time, I was just an observer. Carly fell silent on the other end, confused by my laughter. She asked me why I would laugh, how I could be so cruel. The coldness in my own voice surprised me. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was simply reflecting the reality they had created. I told her that, frankly, I was surprised it had taken this long. I explained that her mother had made a terrible investment in a man with a proven history of running away when things got tough. When she tearfully asked why he would do this to them, I told her that was a question she needed to ask her mother, not me. I reminded her that he had a pattern, that this was what he did. He had left my mother. He had effectively left me. And now, when the fantasy life he had built with them became too difficult, he had left them too. I felt no pity. Carly had been a willing participant on that beach, smiling for the photos that were meant to hurt me. She and her mother had gotten exactly what they had signed up for, a man whose loyalty lasted only as long as the good times did. I told her I had no idea where he was, and that even if I did, I wouldn't tell her. I told her their problems were not my problems, and then I wished her luck and hung up the phone. I put my phone down on the counter with a finality that felt like setting down a great weight for the last time. The cycle was complete. The story was over. When Matt came home, I told him everything. He just nodded, then wrapped me in his arms. He didn't have to say anything. He understood. Lying in bed that night, I didn't feel triumph or revenge. I just felt quiet. The ghost that had haunted me for so long had finally been laid to rest, not by my anger, but by its own self-destruction. My father had been the architect of his own lonely, pathetic end. And I, for the first time in my life, was completely and utterly free to look forward, with nothing but clear skies ahead.